Hello! Welcome to Family Folklore Week. This is a perfect week for me to be doing this personally because I will be at home this coming week with my parents and my extended family for Passover, which is one of the biggest folklore sites in my family. All the rituals and the traditions and the foodways and the stories, I mean, it just all really converges around Passover. It's a major sort of locus of the year. And in fact, there's been an ongoing conversation over email with my aunts and uncles and cousins over the past week about Passover and family jokes and traditions surrounding Passover. And in fact, we managed to unearth a PowerPoint presentation that my cousin made in 2007 for his girlfriend at the time who was coming to Passover to explain Passover to her, our Passover, our specific traditions. Lots and lots of families in the United States and around the world celebrate Passover. But just like lots of families celebrate Thanksgiving. But what makes it unique in our family are all of these little twists and jokes. So that is actually a good example of the big tradition, the sort of big cultural tradition of these different celebrations and holidays and rituals and festivals, the big traditions and the small traditions. So the small traditions are the things that are happening in our folk group in particular, in the family folk group, and the big tradition is the larger cultural practices and larger cultural contexts. Family folklore is folklore performed by families about themselves. It's the traditional practices of families, and it shows us the ways that families traditionalize their experiences. It also gives us insight into these sort of larger cultural patterns, so we can see how American families are interpreting their history and sharing culture in small groups and in larger small groups, if you will, in the folk group. We can see through what is celebrated in stories, in photographs, what is preserved in those ways, and also the customs that we have surrounding different events and practices. We can see what the family values about itself and who the family thinks that it is, how we think about ourselves. So as I was saying about Passover, even though many people celebrate it, and that's something that we have in common with many other families, the particular experiences of it within a family are singular in nature, despite being held in common by many. So the fact that we have these traditions, setting up the Seder plate, asking the 4 questions, all of that is a commonality, but the traditions themselves are singular. It's a bigger change than talking about just versions. The way that, a family tells a story, they're different than another family's stories about their family history. Another example of how there's a commonality of the form, but the experience of the tradition itself is singular, is when we look at the stories that are told in families. So many, if not most families, have these courtship narratives. So we have these stories about courtship. So how mom and dad met, how grandma and grandpa met. And so you probably have all of those stories about your own family. I also have those stories about my family, and my children will have, those stories as well about their family, about how I met their father and how, their grandparents met, just like I've got the stories about how my grandparents met, and I'm sure all of you do too. I also saw on Twitter the other day, for example, somebody was retweeting photos of people's mothers in their wedding dress, and everybody was telling the stories about how their mothers came by those wedding dresses. For example, somebody had saved up the whole $100, and she was the first person in her town to wear a wedding gown as opposed to just a nice dress or a nice suit. And she was very proud of herself, like I said, because she had saved up the whole $100. Somebody else had bought theirs at a thrift store and was a hippie at the time. My grandmother bought, the dress with my mother. They picked it out together. And then at my wedding, I wore my mother's dress, but it was totally refashioned because my mother and I have very different shapes and sizes. So it was totally redone for a modern sensibility, but I still wore my mother's wedding dress. So these kinds of traditions, these kinds of family heritage and photographs and stories, we have them in common in a lot of ways, but the experiences themselves are singular. So the family gives us a place to workshop cultural negotiation. It's where we learn about folklore, and it's also where we learn about how traditions and practices and stories can be those places for contested values. how we can negotiate values within a closed group, how we can work them out through folklore. We can look for folklore in families in the areas that unite us, the areas of negotiation and of tension. We can look at objects of memory, such as heirlooms and photographs, and also the ways that we make our own rituals, even from seemingly inconsequential beginnings. All of the genres of folklore are represented in families' traditional practices. So we have foodways, and foodways include food, what the actual food is, but also how it's prepared, who eats it, who makes it, who cleans up, what the preparation involves in terms of before you're even cooking, who sits where at the table when it's consumed, the recipes, whether those are transmitted orally or are written down or are restricted. For example, there's a family secret recipe. My mom makes these brownies that are actually very simple to make, but it's a family secret what the ingredients are and how to make them. Whether it's a recipe box, so the ways that we collect and store recipes and display recipes and use recipes and access them. These are all parts of foodways in families, well, in general. Also celebrations, the ways that we capture and celebrate the past by reenacting it. So there are religious festivals like Passover, national festivals, the 4th of July, festive occasions like birthdays and baby showers and things like that. Then there are the celebrations that are unique to families, to that specific family, that are created by that family. The material culture, they may also mark our history. Think photographs, scrapbooks, objects of memory, such as heirlooms or even family ornaments. Bringing out the ornaments to decorate a Christmas tree, it's like reliving all of the past Christmases, because you remember, different occasions when you hung it or when you saw it or when you got it. And again, scrapbooks, photo albums, and family photos. There are naming traditions. So baby names, not just what you named the baby, but what you were called as a baby. I have a friend who, actually, I can't even remember her actual name, but she was called Dee Dee as a baby by her sister, and she's still called Dee Dee. She's, I think, in her 40s now. So the names that you're called as a baby, the names that you call people as a baby. I started calling my grandmother Bobby, and we still called her that, well, she's dead now, but we still call her that. Also, traditional names in the family. For example, my daughter is named after her great-grandmother, my grandmother Rissel. My daughter's name is Risa. And my son's name is Simon. That's after my great-grandfather, his great-great-grandfather, Siom. Nicknames are another big, important part of naming traditions. I will not tell you all of the nicknames that I have in my family. My brother, my children call him Uncle Bro. His name is Brian, and he's the least sort of bro-ish person that you ever would meet, but my other brother called him Bro for a host of complicated reasons, and so I still call him Bro, and my children call him Uncle Bro. And there are expressions. So for example, secret codes within the family, like some families will say FHB, if there's not enough food maybe, and they're telling family hold back. That's never a problem in my family because, Jewish family. So there are taboo words that you just don't say. Then there are the words with wings, which are story kernels. We'll talk more about those story kernels next week with personal experience narrative, and nonverbal signals that we give each other within families. And finally, there are stories. We tell stories in families for all sorts of reasons and at all sorts of events. They include, we usually tell them about unusual or remarkable events, or experiences or people, because stories are about those things that stand out to us for a particular reason. So a lot of stories have to do with the first time or the last time, or and aside from first and last, something that really stood out from the everyday experience, something that was really remarkable in some way. So we have our courtship narratives, how mom and dad met, that kind of thing. Narratives of separation and divorce. We have stories about death and dying and relatives at their death and family members, and how different family members respond to death. We have stories about memorable relatives like heroes and rogues and innocence and things like that. We also have stories about money lost, money found, money squandered, that kind of thing. We see so much of the storytelling process also in families. So we see instances of team telling where, for example, a couple will often tell the story together, or a parent and child will tell the story together, each interrupting each other. So if you tell the story, you might have seen this, the story of how people got together, or if you have any friends who are engaged or married, they'll tell the story of the proposal, and they'll, cut in on each other like, no, you tell him how he, no, but remember, then I did this, right? So that's one of the ways that we do this team telling. And then there's also a sense of ownership of stories, and I think you saw this most specifically in the Karen Baldwin article and in Peggy Yoakum's article about who it is that is allowed to tell a story. That's oh, she tells it better. You have to get her to tell it. I don't really remember all the details, that kind of thing. Or, oh, that's really Jenny's story. You'd have to really ask her. In the way that stories are told, you can see how ritual is so often integrated into so many different family traditions. So when we have these shared experiences, and when we transform them into verbal rituals, stories, expressions, we are reenacting them in a way. We're recreating them, not only the first time it happened, but then every subsequent time that the story was told or that the holiday was celebrated. So I've included reading notes and lecture notes and study questions with some of the articles, and I hope that you'll look over those to help you understand the readings a little bit further. And so in conclusion, I'll just say, families traditionalize their experiences. Stories and rituals represent and enact what the family likes about itself, what it wishes to remember and perpetuate. It also shows us the qualities that the family believes set it apart as a family from the outside world. And finally, it reveals an emotional core of family life. So as you go back through the readings from this week, as you think about folklore in your own family, I invite you to consider what emotional core it's revealing about your family, what you as a family wish to remember and celebrate, and what values emerge as being especially prized or owned within that family.